Alrighty, welcome to this Mythic Plus Mage Guide series. I'm doing a series on affixes, and the two I wanted to go over in this video are the bolstering weeks. There's one week where we have bolstering skittish and fortified, and another week where we have bolstering overflowing and tyrannical. I wanted to start with some mage tips in general for bolstering skittish and fortified, where we'll focus first. Each spec of mage has something that they can use to focus down one target. So if you're AoEing a pack of 3, as a frost mage, you can use Ice Lance, arcane missiles, or barrage as an arcane mage, and pyroblast as a fire mage, and those can help by targeting the highest health mob and using those procs on those enemies. As well, for this week, since we have fortified mobs that are getting bolstered, a lot of our damage is going to be dealt and a lot of our time will be spent on trash. Because of that, I would not hold back using cooldowns or saving them for only the boss. So popping your cooldowns as often as you can would be advantageous in this scenario. Also, because we're in Skittish week, something that's really helpful is to have nameplates or an add-on or something to help show when aggro changes. That will help you to get away quickly when a mob does aggro you, or to nova it to keep it in place, or something to help avoid getting one-shot or damaged outside of times when you need to be. Depending on which dungeons you're doing, pulls can typically be a bit smaller since you're dealing with bolstering, unless a dungeon has pulls of 5 or 6, like Blackrock Hold maybe. Before you get to the second boss, those pulls are generally bigger. That depends on the dungeon, but typically you can run with talents that are going to be like 1 to 3 targets and anything cleave related. During the higher levels, there's a lot of mobs that can literally turn around and one-shot you. And because of that, you're going to want to stay at range if at all possible. When you run into mobs that are deal range damage that can't be interrupted, those will be mobs that you'll want to focus down first if possible. And another big help for your team, assuming you guys are on voice communications of some type, which I highly suggest, is communicating when you're going to burst. As a fire mage in 7.1, your burst is almost certainly going to pull aggro off of any mob. As well, if you have really high quickening stacks and you pop your cooldowns, burst as an arcane mage, or if you're frost and you're running Frost Bomb or Glacial Spike, either one, you're going to pull aggro frequently, especially when you have cooldowns up. So if you communicate that to your team, then the tank can be more aware. You can have defensives put on you or whatever it may be to help avoid getting one shot or taking extra damage from Skittish. As far as individual spec helps for fire, you can Dragon's Breath whenever mobs change aggro tables, and that'll help to keep either the melee or you from getting chased and attacked. As well, all 3 specs actually have an invis. Granted, fire and frost have it on a higher cooldown, and that can help to drop aggro. And it may be on a 5-minute cooldown, but you can still use that several times per dungeon. Flame Strike for fire puts a slow on the mobs, and so that can keep any melee mobs off of you for a longer period of time. If they're coming from melee range and you're out of melee range, it'll make it harder for them to reach you. And the same thing goes for frost. Almost all of your abilities have some type of slow. Although you don't typically do large scale AoE, you can drop a blizzard, which will slow all of the mobs for I think it's 15 seconds, and that will help as well. You also have Nova as all 3 classes that can help you kite. And as far as Arcane goes, Arcane has slow down. If you have that ability in your artifact weapon, then you can cast slow while everything's close together, and you'll slow all of the mobs in an AoE. As well, spamming Arcane Explosion in melee range is going to be extremely difficult on any Skittish week, and you'll be doing AoE for a long period of time since we have Fortified and Bolstering. Because of that, depending on mobs, you're going to have to be careful and staying almost at max range as possible when using Arcane Explosion, and being very aware of the aggro tables that can kill you instantly. Also, Supernova gains a little more viability in this week just due to interrupting certain abilities, and when something aggroes you, you can Supernova it right away, and that gives everyone another second to get away. As well, Greater Invis will be huge for Arcane because you have it on a 1.5-minute cooldown, and Arcane Power should typically be used from a distance just due to the burst, and you don't want to be in melee range when you're bursting. Onto the dungeons which are good and bad for this week. Excuse me. Maw is a good dungeon. Typically the packs are smaller, so you're not pulling any 5 mob packs. As well as Court of Stars is not a bad choice as well, just that the imps could be problematic. So having AoE stuns or silences for those would be big. That'll be the hard part of that dungeon. Vault of the Wardens is also a good dungeon. And as far as bad dungeons, Halls of Valor is always a bad dungeon. At least it feels like that. Darkheart Thicket. Oh, I'm getting text. Darkheart Thicket will be for the big pats, the kind of arcane anomaly looking guys that pat back and forth. That can be a really dangerous area. As far as outside of that, the dungeon itself isn't too terrible, but if you pull the pat and then he knocks you back and you spawn a bunch of dragons, or you accidentally pull the blobs, that's a pretty guaranteed wipe, or a 1.5 minutes on one piece of trash. So that could be a dangerous area. Blackrock Hold just has bigger packs in general, and a lot of them are dangerous mobs, such as the archers that do the AoE repetitive thing, which can be interrupted with Supernova or Dragon's Breath, but they're dangerous mobs, as well as the casters there that deal a large amount of damage. And the mobs that stun you, there's a lot of bad mobs in that dungeon. As far as Eye of Ashara goes, it's a pretty decent dungeon, also not as terrible, but the double giants can really be problematic when you get to higher mythic pluses, not to mention the fact that they're skittish. One of them will be bolstered at some point, and they're fortified. So that could be a part that could hold you up there. Archway isn't necessarily a bad dungeon, but since it's so trash oriented, and trash is what either wipes or makes the dungeon easy, it's kind of a bad choice when you're going as far as bolstering and then all the mobs are skittish and they're fortified. So in this case I would probably avoid Archway, as well as Neltharion's Lair, which will be bad with the Pelters and the Scorpions doing additional damage and being bolstered and skittish, especially on higher mythic pluses. And some legendaries that might be good for this week would be the chest. If you have the problem of having multiple legendaries and swapping them out, the chest would be good for survivability, at least in the lower up to maybe like 11, 10, where mobs start to one-shot you. As well, the Time Warp Ring is probably always the best legendary you can bring in a Mythic Plus. The Dragon's Breath Helm will help to hit things from range, and the legendary pants for Arcane are definitely amazing for Mythic Plus, as they allow you to output a ton more damage. On to Bolstering, Overflowing, and Tyrannical. Tyrannical can be terrible depending on which dungeon you're in, but as far as mage-specific tips, once again, you have your Ice Lances, Pyroblasts, Arcane Missiles to even percentages. On this, you do not want to be using your cooldowns every second they come up necessarily, while you do want to use them frequently on Trash to be able to get through the dungeon quicker, and I think that goes more so for Fire and Arcane since you have cooldowns. But you definitely want to have your cooldowns, and for Arcane, your mana backup for the bosses, because the bosses are tyrannical, and you definitely want to have your cooldowns up and be potting on the pull. Defensives are going to need to be used on a lot of boss abilities, specifically on certain bosses that one-shot you. I'm thinking Black Rockhold, the last boss will one-shot you on higher difficulties, as well as the charge from the third boss in that dungeon. So knowing the mechanics for the boss fights thoroughly, and you can't just accidentally, on the second boss of Eye of Ashara, you can't just, what is that curse that gets put on you that you shoot? You can't just shoot that in melee because you're facing the boss. You have to pay attention, because if you do, you will wipe your group, because the damage from Tyrannical is substantially higher. So between using your defensives, knowing when to on the bosses, and doing them correctly, and the mechanics, knowing all of them, that'll be a big part of getting through the Tyrannical week if you're on 10+. As well as with Bolstering, this is going to be smaller packs typically, depending on the dungeon. You can talent accordingly, but keeping in mind when you get to 10+, Tyrannical will definitely want you to be single target favored, because most of the bosses will need that to get them down. This is probably the easiest 2 Affix week for Bolstering and Overflowing. Overflowing doesn't give you much more to deal with as a DPS, and Bolstering is probably one of my least favorites since I'm an Arcane main and I love AoEing, but it's not difficult. It's one of the easier weeks to 4 DPS because you don't have to bring a healer, so it completely negates that effect, and you can run Fighter Chow to heal up after each pull. So keeping that in mind, any tips are going to be typically the same as the previous week as far as Bolstering goes. There's not really anything huge from any of the specs to deal with Overflowing or Tyrannical, other than the fact that Arcane has Greater Invis, which will as a DR to avoid one-shot boss mechanics, and all classes have Ice Block to avoid one-shot mechanics at least once per boss fight. Outside of that, there's nothing amazing about our utility, maybe just keeping an ice barrier up to help with damage, especially on Tyrannical. Maybe popping that before the boss is pulled and then having it again during the encounter. Dungeons that are good for this, once again, is Maw and Court of Stars. The exception to Court of Stars is when you start getting too high in Mythic Plus levels, the last boss becomes extremely difficult on Tyrannical. And Vault of the Wardens is another good one, but once again, it's important to focus down the adds after the second boss. When you get to the side pulls into the adjacent rooms, you need to make sure you don't AoE there and you focus down the big ad and get him to a low enough health before you start killing everything off. More difficult as Frost or Fire, since you'll be automatically cleaving if you run Splitting Ice, or your Ignite will be. Darkheart Thicket is, once again, kind of semi-decent choice, except for when you get too high on 10+, the Tyrannical, the last boss, becomes extremely difficult. Black Rockhold, also the same thing. has bigger packs, so it's not as great a choice here. And the last boss is definitely on 10 plus. His first Void Bolt will one-shot you, so you're going to have to either use Barrier as disc or a healing cooldown that decreases damage taken, or some DRs, personal DRs. Eye of Ashara, not particularly bad. As a tip on Eye of Ashara, especially when you're running Bolstering or any teaming weeks, is to clear all the trash around Serpendrix, and then you could go back to Lady Vashir and pop Hero on her if it takes you long enough, especially on higher difficulties. Arcway on Bolstering without Skittish and Fortified isn't as bad, and it's probably a better choice than it is on Teaming Week. The opening oozes are going to be rough, though, on Bolstering, even without Skittish and Fortified. Varian's Lair isn't as bad. The boss fights aren't typically horrible in there, so the Tyrannical doesn't make it too bad. And once again, with Bolstering, just keeping in mind having the Pelters can really be a problem there when you get to higher Mythic pluses, and you'll probably want to be polymorphing one of them if you're pulling two and an additional mob. As far as legendaries, the chest and the neck don't seem to be as necessary on this. The chest is good for the Tyrannical bosses, especially if you're taking like one tick of something. You can blink out of it and typically help your healer out quite a bit. The Time Warp Ring, once again, is going to be significantly huge on this, specifically so you can have it up on every boss. And outside of that, just any single target damage increase that your class has would be great, specifically for the Tyrannical bosses. But if you enjoyed the video, this is about all we have for the Bolstering weeks. I'll have the other weeks coming in additional videos. And if you like the video or it helps you out in any way, please like and subscribe the video. And we have lots of other mage resources if you check out the description below. I'm typically an Arcane Mage guy, but I will be posting plenty of things for all mages to learn from. So if you can like me on or follow me on Twitter and on Twitch, and I'm love to see you around, and I'm glad to help out. I'm here to help. So if you need help with anything, definitely hit me up and I'll see what I can help you with. But thanks, we'll see you in the next video.